Great. Okay, then welcome everybody. Thank you all for coming to the second of 3 keynotes at Linked Pasts VII. If you're here for the entire Linked Pasts Symposium, you almost certainly know today's speaker already from some of the activities. If you're only here for the keynote, then that's fine too. Welcome. We're delighted that that this keynote will be presented by Katherine McDonough, who, by way of brief introduction, has a PhD from Stanford University from 2013 in 18th century French political history, has taught or otherwise collaborated at Stanford, Bates College and Western Sydney University in the meantime, joined the Turing Institute as part of the Living with Machines project in 2019, and in that time has founded the Special Interest Group on Computer Vision for Digital Heritage and is now the PI of the Machines Reading Maps projects. And Katie is going to talk to us today about linked maps and spatial searching, and we all look forward to it. Thank you, Katie.
Great, thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here. I was just saying before everyone trickled in that I've really benefited from Linked Pasts meetings in the past, and it's really a pleasure to be speaking with you today. So yeah, I'm going to dive right in, and I'm going to be talking about some of the research that I've been doing in the past couple of years while at the Turing, and I'll do some more formal thanks to the large and brilliant teams that are really a part of this research, but just to say first that my colleagues on Living with Machines who have been most involved in the work I'm going to be talking about today include Daniel Wilson, Kazra Hosseini, Casper Beelan, and John Lawrence, as well as Olivia Vane, whose visualizations you'll be seeing. And on the Machines Reading Maps project, that's a project with some collaborators in the US, Yaoyi Chang, Deborah Holmes Wong, PhD students of Yaoyi's, including Zakun Lee and Gina Kim and Dan Feldman, and at the Turing, and of course here today, known to many of you as Valeria Vitale, and last but certainly not least is Rainer Simon, whom you also all know from Recogito fame, which I'll be speaking about in a minute. So yeah, I'm just gonna dive right in, figure out how to move my slides here. All right, great. So the thing that is kind of the foundation of this talk today is really considering working with maps as data. And in the abstract, as you might have seen, I kind of position thinking about you know, what it will mean when we have access to 1 million maps. You know, for the last 10 years, we've really been sort of considering what it means to have access to digitized books, to have 1 million books. What can you do with that, both in terms of close reading, distant reading, and everything in between. And because more and more maps are being scanned by cultural heritage institutions, large and small around the world, there's really an opportunity to think not only about you know, how to sort of work with those materials, but also to feed back to institutions about, you know, what we really need in order to work carefully and critically and productively with these digitized collections. So I hope this talk will appeal to lots of different kinds of audiences, both the people who maybe are curators of these collections, as well as the people who are interested in working with the digitized materials. So this slide is really a way, by way of introduction, of saying, okay, what's different? What can change when we stop working or add into our arsenal of tools ways of working not just with one map at a time, but say 20,000 or even 100,000 maps at once. So there's a very old and you know, well-established and important tradition of going to the reading room, and here you see the British Library maps room, which I'm sure is familiar to many of you. And we have this experience of we order our maps, we go in, and you know, you can look at one or maybe a few maps at a time on these tables. And we are in fact constrained by the size of tables, the number of maps that can be ordered, their preservation status. So there's very good reasons for the fact that we don't actually look at very many maps at once. And this, of course, affects our scholarship. So we end up describing very small numbers of maps in humanities scholarship, and in my case, in historical scholarship. And so maps tend to be a kind of secondary type of primary source. They're a bit in the shadows compared to text. And one of the things that I'm quite interested in as a historian is bringing maps more into the foreground as historical primary sources. So because maps are being digitized, this reading room experience of the kind of very close, deep reading of small numbers of maps has already shifted into an experience of being able to browse lots of maps at once. And so the image here on the right is the equally well-known National Library of Scotland interface, where you can zoom in and out and browse all around, not just Scottish maps, but maps of all of Great Britain, and really begin to kind of look across maps. And this is the beginning of being able to think about, what does it mean, to link maps? Here you see the Ordnance Survey maps, the second edition 6-inch Ordnance Survey sheets that are plotted in this digital Slippy map. And linking these maps allows you to kind of think about the collection on a national scale. So already that's a very important step. But what I really was interested in when I first joined Living with Machines is, how do we go further than that? How do we get beyond simply being able to browse the materials to be able to actually search inside the maps, to go into the content of the maps? So there are some things that you need in order to be able to do that. And the first is metadata. And here, this visualization that my colleague Olivia made for looking at the Ordnance Survey maps again. So this is the 6-inch second edition maps that were surveyed in the late 19th century up to the First World War. The only reason we can make a visualization like this, where the sort of each sheet is being plotted in this interactive movie of the maps, is because we have metadata for the survey date and indeed also the printing date for each sheet. And it's worth saying that it is in fact quite rare to find a series map collection or any kind of large map collection that has been cataloged at item level as opposed to at series level. So the National Library of Scotland has put an immense amount of work into creating this metadata, which makes it just immediately usable by us as researchers. So this is something that it's really invaluable for jumpstarting this kind of research. The other thing we need, of course, are the images of the maps themselves, and not just images, but geo-referenced images. So this is another kind of prerequisite for getting to do the kind of work that I'm going to be describing. And again, that is also a resource-intensive task, and there's lots of people thinking of, especially the work by Bert Spahn on his All Maps project, who are really trying to think about how do we kind of fast track creating geo-referenced versions of the maps of this very large set of cultural heritage materials which are coming into the digital domain, but which it's very hard to do any kind of spatial analysis with until they've been geo-referenced. So the third thing we need is, again, ways to search inside the content of the map. And so today I'm going to be talking about a couple of examples. This is just another slide sort of looking at how we can use metadata to understand the shape of the collection, which is really crucial for sort of thinking about which method we want to use to analyze certain collections of maps. And so the methods I'm going to be talking about today, examples from Living with Machines and Machines Reading Maps, are really methods that we've co-designed using very large teams of experts from multiple disciplines to really be suited to understanding, in this case, Ordnance Survey maps from the 19th century, and in Machines Reading Maps, some additional maps, which I'll talk about in a bit. So I'm just going to move on to talking about Living with Machines. And I'm going to try and put the work into context, sort of each example into context of assuming that the end goal is not sort of to do novel research with computer vision, which is the starting point for a lot of these methods, but in fact to get to creating data sets that are machine readable as text, right, as structured data. So we're ending up turning maps and their visual content into structured text-based data. All right, so just to give you a bit of background, Living with Machines is a digital history project. It's based at the Turing, and we're looking to use archives from the long 19th century in Britain to really kind of write new histories about the lives of ordinary people who lived through the first era of industrialization. We're looking at things like newspaper text, the census, as well as maps in order to write this new history using computational methods. And the last point here is that we're not only studying historical machines and the kind of cultural context of the arrival of machines in people's lives, but we're also trying to understand what it means to be humanists living with machines, working with machines in doing computational research. So the part of Living with Machines that's focused on maps has really embraced working with computer vision as a method to access the content of historical maps. We're really interested in Ordnance Survey maps in particular because there's such a rich way of understanding the ways that Victorians represented the British landscape at that time. And we wanted to use computer vision, again, not to create a kind of novel path-breaking computer vision task, but to use it, to use a kind of established task, which I'll get to in just a second, to work quickly and iteratively with the map images. We wanted to be able to allow historians to ask questions in a kind of flexible environment of a large corpus of maps without having to be experts in computer vision. And it's really important that this method is a kind of humanistic computer vision method that acknowledges the kind of complexities and contingencies around map production in the 19th century, that it is not a representation of some kind of true landscape, but also that we want to remain close to the maps as sources. We're really trying to develop a computer vision task that doesn't extract information and take us away from the primary source. It allows us to stay with the source and iterate through questions and the structured text data that results from those in order to really pinpoint the best ways for searching the content of these maps to answer historical questions. So just to give you a sense of what this pipeline looks like kind of in a more abstract way, in using machine learning and computer vision, first we have to annotate a selection of images manually with the labels that are related to the historical concepts we're interested in identifying on maps. Second, we train a machine learning model to learn the relationship between those labeled examples, between the labels and the example images that we've annotated. And then finally, we infer or we predict that label on a larger set of content. So you can think about that. We take a kind of very, very small sample of maps from the large OS corpus. We annotate those, we train, and then we infer on the nationwide corpus. So the task that we've chosen to use is something that we call the patchwork method. And patches are not a new thing. We did not invent them. They're very common in medical image analysis using computer vision. But they're incredibly useful in the context of historical maps. It's a very simplistic CV task. It uses image classification on a patch or a selection of an image. You can see here that we've gridded up a particular map image. And then we run image classification on each patch within the image as opposed to the image as a whole. And so this way we're getting much more meaningful information. The size of a patch is flexible. It can be adapted according to the kind of thing that you're interested in finding on a map. And it allows us, therefore, to annotate at the patch level, to ask a question, to label each patch according to the concept that we want to identify. So we do this using Jupyter notebooks. I'm gonna talk you through the pipeline in just a moment. But of course, what's really been interesting to us as historians, as digital humanities folks, is this annotation process and it's kind of the decision making that around picking a label. And so this is, I think, get to the heart of this issue of moving from the kind of visual content into something that historians and indeed lots of humanities folks are more comfortable working in and often have the skills to work with. And that's text data, kind of structured qualitative information. And so in fact, a huge amount of labor goes into determining how you go from, say, your question and the concepts that are present in that question, the maps on the one hand, and this kind of label as the meeting space between those things. So this is something that is often overshadowed in computer vision research that we really spend a lot of time on and have thought very carefully about. And I think going forward, as many other people have pointed out in sort of thinking about the importance of annotation in other kinds of humanities machine learning contexts, the practices of annotation, the choices that we make, the guidelines that we write for ourselves are really essential parts of the research process and really can't be underestimated. So what are the labels that we settled on that we're interested in? We ended up wanting to pay attention to something that we call rail space. So we're interested in rail infrastructure, not just tracks or stations. We're interested in really the entire footprint of rail across the British landscape, because railway and in this case rail space is a really interesting index for the arrival of industrialization in communities, or the kind of impact or opportunities for industrialization that a community might have. And rail space is then something that we can later connect up with other data sets to understand, for example, its relationship to broader industrial sites, residential development or removals, comparing rail space to tracks alone, and also understanding the relationship between rail space and so rail as a kind of physical presence in the landscape, alongside rail as something that is used as a sort of transport network for people. So what's coming is a bit awkward because we've submitted a paper to a conference and there's a social media ban until we hear back from the conference. So I'll just ask I'll let you know when this is over, but for the next set of slides to please not tweet about or share just yet. And so thanks for understanding. So the pipeline that we've developed to do this kind of work, to identify labels like rail space, is called MapReader. The pipeline is all about applying this patchwork method that I've just described. So you can see here in this diagram, we ingest maps, we pre-process them and we split them into patches. We do our kind of gold standard training data annotation. There's a process of kind of training and fine tuning and selecting the best model from a selection of models that are already available within MapReader, performing the inference, and then finally visualizing our results. So I'm just going to show you a little bit about what these results look like. So for the experiments that we have run, and that's on rail space, and then we also did an experiment identifying buildings in the British landscape, we annotated about 62,000 patches. And then we selected a ResNet 50 model, and we inferred the labels for the rest of the patches. You can see how we have annotations that feed into producing a national level prediction of rail space and buildings across Great Britain. And this is what this looks like in a bit more detail. So here you can see that the black patches represent rail space, and the red to yellow spectrum represents buildings. We can see here the way that rail space looks in a particular sheet, and that's the detail C, as well as across the entire nation. And of course, what's really exciting is you can start to layer up the outputs of different label experiments, and then start to think about the relationship, say, between rail space and building development across the landscape. And so this is another example of how we can really start to think about how patches and the output from MapReader allows us to search for certain types of spaces across the landscape. And in particular, this is what we call rail shapes, right? So we're interested in sort of a typology of the way that rail exists, is kind of built into the landscape of 19th century Britain. And here you can see, for example, the way that concentrations of rail space look around docks, and the way that they also highlight non-rail space areas. So you can see that, in fact, there's these really interesting areas that are entirely contained by rail space, and often these are islands of industrial areas that are really cut off from other parts of the city or the countryside. And here I've called these industrial islands. So we're just beginning to really work with this output and create these kinds of typologies, and then allow us to find patterns of these typologies across the landscape to understand how rail is both similar and different across counties in the UK. Now, of course, there's a kind of question about, well, why does this matter? And what is the effect of using machine learning as opposed to using human annotation, and of course there is error associated with this. So I just wanted to say that I think what's really exciting about, for example, the rail shapes idea is that we're really shifting into a space of thinking about novel forms of spatial analysis. And I'm going to show how we're even going further than working with just rail space and really adding in other data sets to allow us to think about, say, new ways of conceiving of the impact of industrialization on British society by looking at that representation, its representation in the physical landscape. And the second bit about error, which is a really interesting question in terms of thinking about, to what extent is it okay that there's error in these data sets? How do we cope with that as historians? This is something that, we're really kind of in the middle of thinking about, and I'm sure that other people here are thinking about this as well. I'm really interested to discuss this. Here you see in the image on this slide, what is one of the systematic errors that the model has found, and this is essentially predicting rock outcroppings in the Scottish Highlands as rail space. So obviously that's an error. We can correct for that a certain amount by adding some, specific sort of targeted training data that collects that, but we're never going to remove all error entirely. So we have to think about coping with error in the outputs of these tasks in the same way that we cope with knowing that the archive is always incomplete. I think that adjusting our expectations about, say, the perfection of the outputs of computational research is the kind of next step that we need to take in order to understand what kinds of claims we can make using this data. Okay, so back to normal now. Feel free to say or tweet whatever you like. All right, so what? the work that we've been doing on Living with Machines translates these visual features into historical concepts. It makes map content accessible as structured labeled data, and it does so at a very high resolution on a national scale. And that's really exciting because we rarely have primary sources, even from the 19th century, that are quite so high resolution, so detailed and accessible for, say, not just one town or one county, but the entire nation. And I think the thing that's really exciting is that there are other kinds of series, there are other series maps for other countries around the world. And so we do have a kind of possible future opportunity to think about applying these methods transnationally as well. So what I want to just say a few brief words about before I move on to machines reading maps is this aspect of creating novel categories of spatial analysis. And I think that here, I just want to give an example of something that we're actively thinking about. And this is what happens when you begin to combine rail space and building patch output from MapReader with other data sets. So here what you see is our patch outputs plotted as well as historical station points plotted, and this is the STOPS GB data set that we've also created on Living with Machines. It's a data set of all the passenger railway stations in Great Britain up to today. It's not just the 19th century. And I can share the link for that data set after the talk. But what you see here is a representation of patches. And just sort of talking about the red spectrum here is building patches, and the black is rail space again. So you see for the building patches, we're plotting, we're interested in patches that are more than 1,000 meters from a station, right? So that means that they're probably less likely to see rail as a benefit, as an amenity in that community. But they're still quite close to rail space. So they're far from a station, but they're close to rail, which we're beginning to interpret as a kind of disamenity, right? A disadvantage. And also we're interested in building patches that are actually quite densely related to other building patches. So this is a kind of, we've filtered this so that more than 16% of the adjacent patches are also buildings. And so what you see here in the dark red areas are very densely built areas that are far away from stations and yet close to rail space. And this is us beginning to think again about, how do we not just understand the presence of rail in the landscape, but people's relationship to the railways. And our next steps are really to add in census data and understand the demographics of what it means to have sort of access to rail as an amenity versus proximity to rail space as a disamenity. All right, so I'm going to be moving on to machines reading maps, which is another project that, it's equally based at the Alan Turing Institute, the University of Southern California, and the University of Minnesota, as well as having our colleague at the Austrian Institute for Technology. It's an 18-month AHRC NEH New Directions for Digital Scholarship in Cultural Institutions funded project. And our cultural heritage partners include the National Library of Scotland, the British Library, and the Library of Congress. And so we're really focused on creating data from text on maps. So if Living with Machines was sort of focused on accessing the visual information and translating that into text, what we're doing on machines reading maps is focusing on the text itself and making that machine readable. The maps that we're working with include the Ordnance Survey maps of Britain again, and kind of adding into the mix here, the Sanborn fire insurance maps of US cities, and those come from the Library of Congress. It's a very exciting image data set that has recently come out of copyright and been made available by the Library of Congress. Some of you will have gotten to think about that a little bit in the workshops this week that Valeria has organized. So I just want to give you a little bit of sense of what these maps look like and why we're interested in the text on them. These are Sanborn maps of San Francisco. This is 4th and King. If any of you have ever gotten off the Caltrain and tried to head to the BART, you have walked down this block. So you can see here just the richness of text and the way that also text interacts with other kinds of information, with color, with symbols, and with shapes like building footprints. So in a sense, text is merely the beginning. You know, we really need to have a longer sort of term plan for thinking about the relationship between these different kinds of content on maps. So here is the Ordnance Survey map, just to give you an example of what this looks like and kind of different ways that text appears. One of the real challenges with the Ordnance Survey maps is of course the multiple fonts, especially the kind of Gothic fonts that are used to represent historical sites. So these are both sort of really fascinating historical objects, but also interesting objects from a technical perspective. So the case studies that we're working on at the moment are first looking at the OS maps. York was not a random choice. We're interested in the representation of antiquities on Ordnance Survey maps, how that varies over time, over scale, and of course across different parts of Britain. And it's really possible for us to access information that sets classical sites and objects and places apart from other kinds of historical places, for example, medieval sites, precisely because of that font distinction. Our second case study is with the Sanborn maps. And as you can see here, there's a really kind of rich opportunity to understand the representation of immigrant communities in American cities through the Sanborn maps, because there's just a lot of description about who is living where. The names of businesses reflect the names of the people living in these communities. And so we're interested in the ways that these maps sort of document immigrant communities, especially that may no longer be in place there, that have ceased to occupy these parts of cities, and we can recover some of this history and hopefully not only do research with it, but also make it discoverable to the people who might be interested in it for a variety of reasons in these American cities. So how are we doing this? How are we going to be able to do these experiments? The first is that we need to annotate the maps and create gold standards for evaluation, and also to create training data. We're using a tool that Yao Yi and Zikun Li have created called Map Curator to predict first the text location with a bounding box or a polygon. Second, to just transcribe the text within that polygon. Third, to link that text to a gazetteer or other knowledge-based record. And fourth, to predict the type of that information, right? So is this a label of a building? Is this a label of a mountain or of a city or of a school? And that semantic type could be more or less granular. That's one of the kind of interesting aspects that we're looking at. And then finally, we'll be evaluating the output based on the gold standard annotations that we're making. So I just want to show you what this looks like. If you were at any of the workshops that we hosted with the OS 200 team, you will have gotten a taste of this. But really, what we're doing is we're creating two pathways to creating both manual and predicted annotations. So for any given map, you might choose that you want to do a kind of entirely manual annotation, drawing the bounding boxes, transcribing the text, selecting an entity, attaching it to a gazetteer record or geotagging it, or attaching some user-defined tags or making any other kinds of notes you like. The other option is you can start with an initial prediction to generate those polygons around the text, and then move on to adding the further metadata, the transcription, the entity prediction, entity suggestions, and gazetteer links to do that part manually. So this is distinctive from the kind of standalone full pipeline that we'll be using to predict transcription and gazetteer links and semantic type predictions. But we're integrating that into Recogito, which is very exciting, and hopefully will speed up the process of creating the training data. So what does this look like? Oop, there we go. What does this look like in practice? You can see here on the left for a map, this is one of those famous David Rumsey maps of California as an island. You can see here the predicted polygons around text. It's doing pretty good. It's recognized a couple of mountains and bits of the coast as text. So you could go in and remove those when you are sort of validating the predictions by Map Curator integrated into Recogito. And then you can select a polygon and go in and hand select the gazetteer link, etc. So the manual annotations that we're using in Recogito are a bit different than the kind of pop-up annotation box you'll be familiar with if you've ever used Recogito in the past. The first thing that we've changed is these kind of top-level options for the type of thing it is that you're annotating. And so we've developed this sort of triad of entity, label, and symbol. These are much more kind of map-friendly ways of kind of classifying general content on a map. And while our work with Map Curator isn't yet able to sort of associate a label with the entity or thing on the map that it actually refers to, we're really hoping that that will be a kind of future step. And so we are already annotating our data with that in mind. Another really exciting development is that, of course, we don't always have historical gazetteers for the places that we're annotating. And so we're using Wikidata-based gazetteers that are building on a method created by my colleague, Mariona Collard-Danui on the Living with Machines project, and making it really easy. And this is the work of Valeria Vitale and Rainer Simon, along with Mariona, to make it really easy to transform a selection of Wikidata entries into a linked places format so that we can load those directly into Recogito as a stand-in for a gazetteer. The next thing that we're doing is we're allowing annotations to be grouped. And so this kind of allows what I just mentioned before of a label to be linked to an entity or a label to be linked to a symbol. And here you see an example of the benchmark symbol being linked to the sort of transcription, the number of the benchmark. So just one further example here of the way that grouping works. You can see that the label of a building can be grouped with the building footprint and then attached to a gazetteer record, for example, for the Guildhall School of Music from Wikidata. So if that's the way that we're creating our gold standard data, our training data, the kind of standalone pipeline for processing data once we have that training data is what's called Map Curator. And here you can see this pipeline in this handy diagram that was created by Yao Yi, who likes to remind us that it is a fully automatic pipeline. And the thing that's actually really exciting about this pipeline is that it's also a way to perform a kind of rough georeferencing of images. So because Map Curator is designed to recognize text on maps, and it's designed to link that text to a gazetteer record, we can use those gazetteer links for the points associated with the text on the map as control points. and to then therefore predict a kind of rough location for the sheet as a whole. And that's really exciting and indeed really important, because many collections are not georeferenced, and so we need to be able to quickly georeference maps. So this has really been essential to enabling our work. So I just wanted to say a few words before I begin to wrap up about why it's useful or kind of interesting to think about image as text. I think first, it does lower a barrier for working with maps. Processing text is a skill that's already more widespread. Unless you're an art historian or indeed a map fanatic like some of us, you may not be used to thinking with, and certainly not computationally processing visual information. And of course, the other point is that it really encourages us to think about the ways that we're categorizing historical knowledge and making choices about this transparent. So, I mentioned earlier the work that we're doing to really think carefully about the labels that we're choosing for patches. The way that we do that, the documentation of our annotation choices is a really explicit demonstration of how we're interpreting information already for that sort of annotation task of creating training data. And I think this is a really important element of computational humanities research, of digital history, whatever you want to call it, whatever community you belong to, making our research reproducible and transparent and showing people how we're making these decisions is really, really essential. And it shows how we're contributing to a conversation that has a very long historiography, for example, and not making kind of definitive final answer, interpretations about data, but showing that we're part of a conversation. We're showing our working, we're showing our thinking, and we're open to conversation about how to improve models, how to change our interpretations in the future. So, I opened the talk with this question about what it means to have access to 1 million maps. And I think that, it's really essential to make maps easier to use as primary sources, and to think about how we can use them in very large sets. Series maps in particular, created from the late 18th century up to the middle of the 20th century, are this really rich repository of albeit state-created information. There's a politics of these maps that is really essential to working with them, but they're crucial primary sources for understanding the changes in the physical and natural environments over this period. And I think they should really become more central primary sources in a range of disciplines. I think working with maps in this way also helps us learn to move across different scales of historical analysis. So this is something that we're really engaging with on both Living with Machines and Machines Reading Maps. If we're not just working closely with one map, what does it mean to make claims about 10,000 or 50,000 maps at a time? And I think there's really no replacement, of course, for having specific examples that you find that you can tell stories with. But as we're showing with the work on Living with Machines, we have an opportunity in creating these sort of things like the patches and associating them with other data sets, in particular sort of census data. We have an opportunity to really create new kinds of associations between data sets that we're indexing spatially, and therefore able to search spatially, that is really opening up doors in historical question asking, and of course the nature of the scale of our interpretation, that I'm really excited to see where we go in the next few years. And then I think the final point here is to say that we're building these methods for searching inside maps with scholars in other disciplines. And I think this kind of co-design of computational tools is absolutely essential for making sense of these historical documents. there's no replacement for having historians and curators and geographers and really anyone else who's a kind of expert in these materials and used to close reading them, and pairing us up with people who have image processing skills, for example. So, it's been really productive to work on these projects. I'm really excited to answer questions about them. Please follow our work as it continues on the Living with Machines and Machines Reading Maps GitHub repos. And then just finally, a final thanks to the teams. Here you see the Living with Machines team and the Machines Reading Maps team. Yeah, so say thank you, and I look forward to your questions.